My name is Matthias Crow, and I've been the groundskeeper at St. Aldrich's Sanctuary for 3 years now. Most people don't even know this place exists anymore. It sits about 40 miles north of town, hidden behind a thick wall of pine trees and a rusted iron gate that's been chained shut since 1987. But I have the key, and every morning I drive my old pickup truck down that cracked stone path to maintain what's left of this place. The job pays well, better than anything else I could find with just a high school diploma and a habit of asking too few questions. The church diocese handles my paycheck through some kind of trust fund, and they don't care what I do as long as I follow the 5 rules they gave me on my first day. These aren't suggestions. They're requirements for keeping this job, and more importantly, for keeping my life. Rule 1. Never enter the sanctuary between sunset and sunrise. Rule 2. Always carry blessed salt in your left pocket. Rule 3. If the bell tower chimes more than 12 times in 1 hour, leave the grounds immediately. Rule 4. Replace the altar candles every Tuesday and Friday before noon. Rule 5. If you hear children singing anywhere on the property, do not investigate. When Father Domenico first handed me that list, I thought it was some kind of test. Maybe they wanted to see if I'd laugh or ask stupid questions. But something about the way he looked at me, the way his hands shook when he gave me the key ring, told me these weren't jokes. The previous groundskeeper lasted 8 months, he said. The one before that made it 6 weeks. You seem like a practical man, Matthias. Practical men follow instructions. I took the job because I needed the money. My apartment was 2 months behind on rent, and my truck needed new brakes. But after the first week at St. Aldrich's, I realized the money wasn't the reason I stayed. The place gets under your skin. St. Aldrich's was built in 1823 by a group of monks who'd traveled here from somewhere in Eastern Europe. The main building is gray stone, 3 stories tall, with narrow windows that look like closed eyes. The bell tower rises another 40 feet above that, topped with a copper cross that's turned green with age. Behind the main sanctuary, there's a smaller building that used to be living quarters for the monks, and beyond that, a cemetery with headstones so old the names have worn away. The whole property covers about 15 acres, most of it overgrown with weeds and wild grass that I'm supposed to keep trimmed. There's also a small garden behind the sanctuary, where herbs and vegetables grow in neat rows, even though nobody plants them. I just water them and pick out the weeds. On my first Tuesday, I learned why Rule 4 exists. I'd been putting off the candle replacement because it seemed like busy work. The sanctuary was locked anyway, and who was going to notice if I waited until Wednesday? But when I woke up that morning, something felt different. The air outside my apartment was too still, like the whole world was holding its breath. When I got to St. Aldrich's, I noticed the front door of the sanctuary was standing open. Not wide open, just cracked enough that I could see a thin line of darkness inside. I always checked that door every evening before I left, and it was always locked tight. The brass handle was old and heavy, the kind that took real effort to turn. I pulled out my key ring, but when I touched the door, it swung open with the smallest push. The inside of the sanctuary was exactly what you'd expect from an old church. Wooden pews arranged in rows, a center aisle leading to the altar, stained glass windows depicting saints I didn't recognize. But the altar candles had burned down to nothing, leaving only small pools of wax on the brass holders. I went to the supply closet and got out 5 new candles. Each one was about as thick as my thumb and pure white, with a small cross carved into the base. As I replaced them, I noticed something odd about the wax pools. They weren't random puddles. They'd formed shapes that almost looked like letters, but not quite, like someone had tried to write something but didn't know how to form the words properly. I cleaned up the wax and lit the new candles. The flames caught immediately, burning bright and steady. But as I stepped back, I noticed they were all leaning in the same direction, toward the back corner of the sanctuary, where a small wooden confessional sat covered in dust. Wind, I told myself. Just a draft coming from somewhere. But the air in the sanctuary was completely still. I finished my work and locked the door behind me, double-checking the handle 3 times. For the rest of that day, every time I looked at the sanctuary, I expected to see the door hanging open again, but it stayed closed. Wednesday morning, I found a dead crow on the front steps. Not unusual by itself. Birds die all the time, especially around old buildings. But this crow was arranged in a very specific way. Its wings were spread wide, and its head was turned to face the door, like it had been trying to get inside when it died. There was no blood, no sign of injury. It just looked like it had laid down and stopped breathing. I buried it in the cemetery and forgot about it until Thursday, when I found 2 more crows in the exact same position. Friday was Candle Day again, and this time I didn't hesitate. I got to the sanctuary right after sunrise and unlocked the door. The candles from Tuesday were still burning, even though they should have burned out after 8 or 10 hours. The flames were smaller now, barely more than blue sparks dancing on the wicks. As I replaced them, I heard something that made me stop moving entirely. Footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps walking across the floor above the sanctuary. St. Aldrich's had a second story that used to be office space for the monks, but I'd never been up there. Father Domenico had given me keys to everything except those upstairs rooms. Step, step, step. The sound moved from one end of the building to the other, then back again, like someone pacing back and forth. But the footsteps were too heavy to be human. Each one made the old wooden ceiling creak and groan. I finished replacing the candles as quickly as I could and got out of there. That afternoon, I called Father Domenico. "Is anyone else supposed to be on the property?" I asked. "No," he said immediately. "You're the only person with access. Why?" I told him about the footsteps, about the crows, about the door being open on Tuesday. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a long silence. "Matthias," he said finally, "are you following the rules I gave you?" "Yes, sir." "All of them? Exactly as written?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Keep doing that. And don't worry about the upstairs rooms. They're not your responsibility." He hung up before I could ask any more questions. That weekend, I started paying closer attention to the details around St. Aldrich's. Things I'd dismissed as normal started to seem strange. Like the way the grass in the cemetery grew in perfect circles around each headstone, even though I never planted it that way. Or how the herb garden always had exactly the right amount of water, even on days when it didn't rain. But the strangest thing was the silence. Most places, even quiet places, have some kind of background noise. Birds, insects, wind in the trees. St. Aldrich's had none of that. When I stood in the middle of the grounds, the only sound was my own breathing. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, like the ground was absorbing the sound. The following Tuesday, I made sure to get to the sanctuary early. The door was locked tight, just like I'd left it. But when I stepped inside, I smelled something that hadn't been there before. Flowers. Fresh flowers, like someone had just brought in a big bouquet. But there were no flowers anywhere in the sanctuary. I checked every corner, every pew, even behind the altar. Nothing. As I replaced the candles, the smell got stronger, sweet and heavy, almost overwhelming, like being in a florist shop during summer. But underneath that sweetness was something else, something that reminded me of the funeral home where we'd held my grandfather's service. I lit the new candles and stepped back to check my work. That's when I noticed the confessional in the back corner was different. The door was open, just a crack, maybe an inch wide. But I was certain it had been closed every other time I'd been in the sanctuary. The confessional was old and dusty, the kind of thing that probably hadn't been used in decades. There was no reason for the door to be open. I walked over to close it, but when I got close enough to touch the handle, I heard something that made me freeze. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing coming from inside the confessional. like someone was sitting in there waiting. But that was wrong. The breathing was too slow, too deep. Each breath lasted about 10 seconds, and the pause between breaths was even longer. No person breathes like that. I backed away from the confessional and finished my work as quickly as possible. But as I headed for the door, I heard the breathing change. It got faster, more excited, like whatever was in there knew I was leaving. I didn't run, but I walked faster than usual. That afternoon, I drove into town and bought a small digital recorder. If there really was something in that confessional, I wanted proof. Not because I thought anyone would believe me, but because I needed to know I wasn't losing my mind. Friday morning, I hid the recorder behind one of the pews before I started changing the candles. The confessional door was closed again, but I could still smell those flowers. Stronger than before, almost choking. I worked quickly, replacing each candle and lighting it without looking toward the back corner. But I could feel something watching me. Not the usual feeling of being alone in a big empty space. This was specific, focused attention, like standing on a stage with a spotlight pointed at you. When I finished, I retrieved the recorder and left. At home that night, I plugged the recorder into my computer and listened to the audio. For the first few minutes, there was nothing but the sound of me working. Footsteps, the scratch of matches, my own quiet breathing. Then, at exactly the 12-minute mark, there was something else. A voice. Quiet, almost whispered, but clear enough to understand. It was speaking in a language I didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakable. It was calling to someone, calling them to come closer. The voice continued for about 30 seconds, then stopped. A few minutes later, it started again, saying the same words in the same tone, like a recording playing on repeat. But it wasn't a recording. There were small variations each time, tiny changes in emphasis that meant someone was actually speaking those words, over and over, while I changed the candles. I listened to the whole recording 3 times before I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The voice was coming from directly behind me, not from the confessional in the back corner, from right behind where I'd been standing at the altar. The next morning was Saturday, which meant I had the weekend off. But I couldn't stop thinking about that voice, about the way it had been calling out in that strange language. I tried to research St. Aldrich's online, but there wasn't much information. Just a few mentions in historical documents about the monastery being abandoned in the 1800s after unexplained events. No details about what those events were. Sunday night, I dreamed about the sanctuary. In the dream, I was changing the candles like always, but every time I lit one, the flame would immediately go out. I kept trying, striking match after match, but the candles wouldn't stay lit. And that voice was there, speaking its strange words, getting louder and more insistent. In the dream, I finally turned around to see who was speaking. I woke up before I could see their face, but the image stayed with me all day. In the dream, the person behind me hadn't been standing on the floor. They'd been floating about 3 feet off the ground, and their feet were pointing down like they were hanging from something I couldn't see. Monday morning, I almost called in sick. But I needed this job, and I'd promised Father Domenico I would follow the rules exactly. So I drove out to St. Aldrich's and tried to focus on the ordinary tasks. Mowing the grass, weeding the garden, checking the fence line for damage. But every time I looked at the sanctuary, I remembered that voice. And I started to wonder, what would happen if I broke one of the rules? What if I went into the sanctuary after dark? What if I left my blessed salt at home? What if I ignored the bell tower if it chimed too many times? These weren't idle questions. They felt like genuine temptations, like something was trying to convince me to test the boundaries. Tuesday morning came faster than I wanted it to. I got to St. Aldrich's just after sunrise, hoping to get the candle replacement done quickly and spend the rest of the day working outside. But when I pulled up to the sanctuary, I saw something that made me sit in my truck for a full 5 minutes before getting out. The front door was wide open, not just cracked like before, but completely open, like someone had thrown it back as hard as they could. And there were things scattered on the steps. At first, I thought it was trash, but when I got closer, I realized they were pages torn from books. Old pages, yellowed and brittle, covered in text I couldn't read. I gathered up the pages and examined them. The writing looked like Latin, but not quite. Some of the letters were familiar. Others looked like they belonged to a completely different alphabet. At the top of one page, someone had written a word in pencil: Aldrich. Inside the sanctuary, the candles from Friday were still burning. All 5 flames were exactly the same size, about an inch tall, flickering in perfect rhythm, like they were breathing together. The confessional door was open again, wider this time. Wide enough that I could see inside to the small wooden seat where people used to sit and confess their sins. But the seat wasn't empty. There was a book lying open on it. I approached carefully, my left hand checking my pocket to make sure the blessed salt was still there. The book was bound in dark leather, and its pages were the same yellowed paper as the ones I'd found outside. But these pages weren't torn. They were intact, and the writing on them was clear and precise. As I got closer, I could see that someone had been writing in the margins. Fresh ink, probably from a ballpoint pen. Notes in English, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Day 1. The voice speaks in Old Church Slavonic. Translation incomplete. Day 3. Confirmed. Not random words. It's a summoning prayer. Day 7. The breathing pattern matches descriptions from the Aldrich journals. Day 12. I understand now. He never left. At the bottom of the page, in the same handwriting but much shakier, someone had written, "Don't let them change the rules." I closed the book and picked it up. It was heavier than it should have been for its size, and warm to the touch like it had been sitting in direct sunlight. But the confessional was in the darkest corner of the sanctuary. I replaced the candles, working faster than usual. The whole time, I could feel that focused attention again, stronger than before, like multiple sets of eyes watching every move I made. The flower smell was back too, but now it was mixed with something else. Something that reminded me of wet earth and old wood. When I finished, I took the book with me. That afternoon, I tried to research the handwriting samples online, but I couldn't find anything useful. The notes mentioned Aldrich journals, which made me think there might be historical records somewhere. But every search I tried came up empty. I called Father Domenico again. "Father, I found a book in the sanctuary today. It has notes about St. Aldrich. Do you know anything about journals or historical records?" There was a long pause. Then, "Where exactly did you find this book?" "In the confessional. Someone left notes in the margins about translation work and something called Old Church Slavonic." Another pause, longer this time. "Matthias, I need you to bring that book to me immediately. Don't read any more of it. Don't try to translate anything, just bring it to me." "Is everything okay? Just bring me the book." He hung up. I looked at the book sitting on my kitchen table. The leather cover was completely plain, no title or markings. But now that I was really looking at it, I could see that the leather wasn't quite the right color. It was too dark, almost black, with a texture that reminded me of something I couldn't place. I opened it to the page with the handwritten notes and read them again. The person who wrote them had been working on this for at least 12 days. They'd figured out that the voice in the sanctuary was speaking Old Church Slavonic, an ancient religious language. They'd identified it as a summoning prayer, and they'd concluded that he never left. But who was he? St. Aldrich himself? One of the monks? Someone else entirely? I turned the page and found more notes, these ones even more urgent. Day 15. The candles burn too long. They should consume completely in 8 to 10 hours, but these last for days. Something is feeding the flames. Day 18. Counted the headstones in the cemetery. Official records show 23 monks buried there. I count 24 graves. Day 21. Found the extra grave. No headstone, but the ground is different, softer, like it was dug recently. Day 23. He's in the extra grave. They buried him, but the blessing didn't hold. At the bottom of this page, in letters so shaky I could barely read them. The rules aren't protection, they're containment. I slammed the book shut, but even with it closed, I could still see those words in my head. The rules aren't protection, they're containment. That changed everything. I'd thought the rules were meant to keep me safe while I worked at St. Aldrich's, but if they were containment, that meant they were designed to keep something else from getting out. Something that was already there. I spent the rest of the evening trying to convince myself that the notes were just the ramblings of someone who'd spent too much time alone in a creepy old building. People see patterns where none exist. They convince themselves that coincidences are evidence of supernatural activity. But deep down, I knew better. I'd heard that voice. I'd smelled those flowers. I'd seen the candles burning longer than they should, and I'd felt those eyes watching me work. Wednesday morning, I drove to St. Aldrich's with the book in my passenger seat, planning to drop it off with Father Domenico after I finished the day's work. But when I got to the sanctuary, I found something that made me change my plans. The cemetery had a new headstone. It was right where the note said the extra grave would be, about 20 feet behind the main group of monuments. The stone was fresh, clean white marble that stood out sharply against the weathered gray headstones around it. And it had a name carved into it. Brother Aldrich, 1798 to 1847. But according to everything I'd read, St. Aldrich's was built in 1823. If Brother Aldrich died in 1847, he would have been at the monastery for 24 years. Long enough to become very attached to the place. Long enough to not want to leave. I walked over to examine the headstone more closely. The carving was professional, the kind of work that would have cost several $1,000s. But there was no way someone had installed this stone recently. The ground around it looked like it had been undisturbed for decades, except the notes in the book said this grave was newer than the others. I knelt down and touched the soil. It was softer than the ground around the other graves, easier to dig, like it had been turned recently, then allowed to settle. That's when I noticed the smell. Flowers, the same overwhelming floral scent I'd been smelling in the sanctuary, but out here, away from any actual flowers, it was clearly not natural. It was too strong, too perfect, like someone had sprayed flower-scented perfume all over the grave. I stood up quickly and backed away from the headstone. From where I was standing, I could see directly into the sanctuary through one of the side windows. The confessional door was closed, but there was someone sitting in the front pew, a figure in dark clothing, perfectly still, facing the altar. My first thought was that Father Domenico had come to check on things, but as I watched, the figure didn't move at all. Not even the small movements you'd expect from someone breathing or shifting position. They sat like a statue, completely motionless. I walked around to the front of the sanctuary, expecting to find the door locked like it should be during the week. But it was standing open again, and when I stepped inside, the front pew was empty. But it was warm, like someone had been sitting there for hours. I checked every pew, every corner, even the confessional. The sanctuary was completely empty, but that focused attention feeling was stronger than ever. Like I was being watched by multiple people from multiple directions. The altar candles were burning normally, exactly as I'd left them on Tuesday. But now there were 6 candles instead of 5. The 6th one was smaller than the others, placed slightly apart from the group. Its flame was a different color too, more blue than yellow. I approached the altar carefully. The sixth candle was definitely new, but it was made of the same white wax as the others. It even had the small cross carved into the base. But I hadn't put it there, and I was certain it hadn't been there on Tuesday. As I examined the candles, I heard something that made me step back quickly. Humming. Someone was humming a tune I didn't recognize, something slow and melodic. The sound was coming from above me, from the second floor that I'd never been allowed to access. But it wasn't quite right. The humming had an echo to it, like it was coming from inside a large empty space. And underneath the melody, there was another sound. A rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on wood. Tap, 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 tap. The humming stopped, but the tapping continued. It moved across the ceiling from one end of the sanctuary to the other, then back again. The same pattern I'd heard on my first Friday, but faster now, more urgent. I left the sanctuary and locked the door behind me, but I could still hear the tapping. Even from outside, even with the thick stone walls between us, that rhythmic sound carried clearly. Tap, 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 tap. It followed me all the way to my truck. That afternoon, I called Father Domenico and told him I was bringing the book immediately. I also told him about the new headstone, about the figure in the pew, about the sixth candle and the humming from upstairs. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. "Father, are you there?" "I'm here," he said finally. "Matthias, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Have you been following the rules exactly as I gave them to you?" "Yes, sir." "Have you entered the sanctuary after sunset?" "No, sir." "Have you ever forgotten to carry the blessed salt?" "No, sir." "Have you heard the bell tower chime more than 12 times?" I thought about that. I'd heard the bell tower exactly 12 times on several occasions, always at noon. But more than 12? I couldn't remember ever counting beyond that. "No, sir, I don't think so. And the children singing? Have you heard that?" "No, sir, not singing." "Good. Those rules exist for very specific reasons, Matthias. As long as you follow them exactly, you'll be safe. But I need you to understand something. The previous groundskeepers who didn't last very long, they started making small exceptions. They thought they understood the situation better than the people who created those rules. What happened to them? They found work elsewhere," he said, but something in his tone suggested that wasn't the whole truth. "Father, what's really going on at St. Aldrich's?" "Bring me the book," he said. "We'll talk when you get here." I drove to the diocesan office in town with the book on the seat beside me. Every few minutes I could swear I heard that humming again, faint but persistent, like someone in the passenger seat humming under their breath. But every time I looked, the seat was empty. Father Domenico met me in the parking lot, which struck me as odd. Usually when I had to speak with him, we met in his office. But this time, he came outside before I'd even turned off the engine. "Do you have the book?" I handed it to him through the window. He took it carefully, holding it away from his body like it might be contagious. "Father, I need to know what's happening out there." He looked at the book, then at me. Brother Aldrich was the last monk at St. Aldrich's. When the others left in 1847, he refused to go. He claimed he'd received a vision telling him to stay and guard the sanctuary. Guard it from what? According to the church records, Brother Aldrich believed that St. Aldrich's had been built on a site of spiritual significance. He thought the monastery was keeping something contained, something that would be released if the holy ground was ever abandoned. And the other monks just left him there? They had no choice. The local diocese had ordered the monastery closed due to irregularities in their religious practices. Brother Aldrich barricaded himself inside the sanctuary and refused to come out. When they finally broke down the door 3 weeks later, they found him dead at the altar. So they buried him in the cemetery? Father Domenico shook his head. That's where the story gets complicated. According to the official records, Brother Aldrich was buried in the town cemetery, not on the monastery grounds, but other documents suggest otherwise. The notes in the book mention 24 graves instead of 23. Yes, and if Brother Aldrich is buried on the monastery grounds, that creates a problem. What kind of problem? The kind that requires very specific rules to manage. He tucked the book under his arm and stepped back from my truck. Matthias, I want you to take tomorrow off. Don't go to St. Aldrich's. Don't even drive past it. Stay in town. Stay around other people. Why? What's going to happen tomorrow? Tomorrow is the anniversary of Brother Aldrich's death. And if the pattern holds, tomorrow night is when he'll try to make contact. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Contact with who? With whoever is maintaining his sanctuary. Father Domenico turned and walked toward the church office, carrying the book with him. But before he reached the door, he stopped and looked back at me. Matthias, if you hear the bell tower chime more than 12 times tomorrow night, remember Rule 3. Leave immediately. Don't hesitate, don't investigate, just leave. And if I don't hear it, then you'll be fine until Friday. He went inside, leaving me sitting in my truck with more questions than answers. That night, I tried to follow his advice and stay away from anything related to St. Aldrich's. I watched television, ordered pizza, called my sister in Ohio. Normal, everyday activities. But around 11 o'clock, I started hearing that humming again. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my television, but it gradually got louder, more distinct. The same slow melodic tune I'd heard in the sanctuary. And underneath it, that rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. I turned off the television and listened carefully. The humming was definitely coming from outside my apartment, but I couldn't tell where exactly. It seemed to move around, first from the parking lot, then from the alley behind the building, then from somewhere above me. I looked out my window, but the parking lot was empty. No cars, no people, no explanation for what I was hearing. The humming continued until almost 3 in the morning, then stopped abruptly. But even after it was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing just outside my door, waiting for me to open it. I didn't sleep at all that night. Thursday passed quietly. I stayed in town like Father Domenico had suggested, running errands and avoiding any roads that led toward St. Aldrich's. But as evening approached, I started to feel anxious. Not the normal kind of anxiety, but something deeper. Like my body was telling me I needed to be somewhere else. By 10 o'clock, the feeling was so strong I could barely sit still. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get in my truck and drive out to the monastery. Not because I wanted to, but because something needed me there. I made it until 11:30 before I gave in. The drive to St. Aldrich's took 20 minutes, and the whole way, I kept telling myself I would just check the property and leave. Make sure everything was secure, then go home and wait for Friday. But when I reached the iron gate, I could see lights in the sanctuary windows. Warm, flickering lights, like candles. But I'd replaced the altar candles on Tuesday, and they should have burned out by now. There was no electricity in the building, no other source for those lights, unless someone was inside. I parked outside the gate and walked up the stone path. The lights were definitely coming from inside the sanctuary, and as I got closer, I could see that all the windows were glowing. Not just the ones at altar level, but the high windows near the ceiling too. The front door was standing wide open, and music was coming from inside. Not humming this time, but actual singing. Multiple voices harmonizing in that same strange language I'd heard on my recording. It was beautiful. Haunting and complex. The kind of music that makes you want to get closer, even when you know you shouldn't. I checked my watch. 11:53. According to Rule 1, I wasn't supposed to enter the sanctuary between sunset and sunrise. But I wasn't planning to go inside, I just wanted to see who was in there, who had lit all those candles and was singing those ancient songs. I approached the open door carefully, staying just outside the threshold. The singing was coming from the altar area, but when I looked inside, I couldn't see anyone. The sanctuary was full of light, bright as midday, but completely empty. No people, no explanation for the music that filled the air. But the altar was different. Instead of 5 candles, there were dozens, maybe 100, all burning with the same steady flame. They covered the entire altar surface and extended down the steps, creating a river of light that flowed toward the back of the sanctuary. And in the center of all those candles, someone had placed an open book. The same book I'd given to Father Domenico that afternoon. As I watched, the singing grew louder, more urgent. The language was still unfamiliar, but the emotion behind it was clear. It was a celebration, a joyful welcome home. I looked at my watch again. 11:59. That's when I heard the bell tower begin to chime. 1, 2, 3. I counted along, expecting it to stop at 12 like it always did. 4, 5, 6. But it kept going. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, then 13, 14, 15. Rule 3 was very clear. If the bell tower chimed more than 12 times, I was supposed to leave immediately. But as I turned to go, the singing stopped. The sudden silence was so complete, it felt like the world had ended. And then, from inside the sanctuary, someone called my name. Matthias. The voice was calm, friendly, familiar, like an old friend greeting me after a long absence. Matthias, please come in. We've been waiting for you. I took a step backward, away from the door. Don't be afraid. You've done such good work here. You've followed the rules so carefully. But the rules have changed now. The bell tower continued chiming. 16, 17, 18. The others made mistakes, but you understand. You know this place needs a guardian, someone who appreciates its true purpose. I turned and ran. Behind me, the chiming grew faster, more frantic. By the time I reached my truck, it was ringing constantly, one chime blending into the next in a continuous peal that followed me all the way home. Friday morning, I called Father Domenico before I even got out of bed. I went to St. Aldrich's last night, I said. The bell tower chimed 18 times, maybe more. Someone was singing inside the sanctuary, and they knew my name. Are you all right? I think so. But Father, they said the rules had changed. There was a long pause. Matthias, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The rules have not changed. They will never change. Whatever you heard last night was not authorized by the church. Then who was it? Someone who wants you to believe that your job has different requirements than it actually does. Brother Aldrich? Perhaps. The important thing is that you didn't enter the sanctuary. You followed Rule 3 exactly as you were supposed to. But what happens now? Do I keep working there? Yes. Today is Friday, which means you need to replace the altar candles. Everything will be back to normal. How can you be sure? Because this has happened before, Matthias. Brother Aldrich tests every groundskeeper on the anniversary of his death. The ones who pass the test continue working. The ones who don't find work elsewhere? Eventually. I hung up and got dressed, but I couldn't stop thinking about that voice calling my name. It had sounded so reasonable, so convincing, like someone who genuinely wanted to help me understand something important. But Father Domenico was right. The rules hadn't changed. They were still the same 5 simple instructions I'd been following for 3 years. When I got to St. Aldrich's that morning, everything was exactly as it should be. The front door was locked, the sanctuary was dark, and the altar held 5 normal candles that had burned down to small stubs. I replaced them quickly and efficiently, just like always. The familiar routine was comforting after the strangeness of the previous night. As I lit the last candle, I noticed something that made me smile. The confessional door was closed, and it stayed closed. For the first time since I'd started working at St. Aldrich's, I felt like I was truly alone in the sanctuary. No watching eyes, no sense of being observed. Just me and the peaceful quiet of an old holy place. I finished my work and locked the door behind me, double-checking the handle like I always did. Outside, the cemetery looked normal too. 24 headstones, including the new one for Brother Aldrich, all standing quietly in their neat rows. The ground around each grave was firm and settled, the way cemetery soil should be. As I walked back to my truck, I heard something that made me stop and listen. Birds, real birds, singing in the trees around the property. It was the first time I'd heard any wildlife at St. Aldrich's, and the sound was wonderful. I drove home feeling better than I had in weeks. Monday morning, Father Domenico called me. "How did everything go on Friday?" "Fine," I said. "Completely normal, no problems at all." "Good. I think you've proven yourself, Matthias. Brother Aldrich knows you're not going anywhere, and he's willing to accept that. So things will stay calm from now on, as long as you keep following the rules exactly as they're written." "I will. I know you will. You're a practical man, just like I thought." After he hung up, I realized something important. I was no longer afraid of St. Aldrich's. The place still felt strange, still had its secrets, but I understood my role there now. I was the groundskeeper. I maintained the property, followed the rules, and kept everything running smoothly. In return, Brother Aldrich allowed me to do my job without interference. It was a fair arrangement. This morning marks the beginning of my 4th year at St. Aldrich's. I still follow the 5 rules exactly as Father Domenico gave them to me. I still carry blessed salt in my left pocket, still replace the altar candles on Tuesdays and Fridays, still listen for the bell tower to make sure it never chimes more than 12 times. And sometimes, on quiet Friday mornings when the light is just right, I hear that humming from upstairs. But it's different now. Peaceful, content. Like Brother Aldrich is satisfied with the work I'm doing. The job still pays well, and I'm good at it. Most importantly, I've learned that some places need people who can follow instructions without asking too many questions. St. Aldrich's is one of those places, and I'm one of those people.